Welcome to Slack Frontiers Executive Track. I'm Brian Elliott. I lead the Future Forum, and I'll be your host here today. Thanks for joining us for the next hour and a half or so. We appreciate you spending the time. First, I'll be digging in and sharing some results from our original research on remote work, what lessons we've learned, and what you can do to make working lives better for all of your employees. Then, Adam Grant will join us and discuss leadership in today's work environment. Adam's then going to host a panel with Slack's own Stuart Butterfield and Nadia Rawlinson, along with Nicola Lamoureux from IBM and Srinivas Sarathi from Northwestern Mutual. After that, we'll take a brief break, then we'll head into the breakout sessions that you all pre-selected to get into some meaty challenges together. First, a little bit of background on me and the Future Forum. I spent the last few years at Slack leading our platform team. Before that, at Google, I ran Google Express. I've been the CEO of startup companies along the way, but across my 2 decades leading and building teams and companies, I learned, often the hard way, that culture eats strategy. I think the challenges people face in today's environment are actually a huge opportunity to question decades of orthodoxy about 9-to-5 office-centric work culture and to transform, to reimagine culture and norms, and to leverage modern tools and technology to make our teams better, more productive, more agile, and more aligned. Future Forum is a consortium backed by Slack. We're dedicated to helping companies thrive in a digital-first world. To start, we're focused on insights like the research I'll be sharing with you today here, and events like not only today's executive track, but more importantly, the breakout sessions, opportunities for executives to come together in small groups in confidential discussions to share your challenges and to find what other people are doing to solve them. We've all seen the headlines. They tell all the stories. Now, they're all true, but they don't tell a complete story. In less than a week in mid-March, companies made more massive change than many thought was possible. These changes were possible, though, because of underlying shifts in technology, broadband access, VPN, and SaaS tools. But most companies simply did a lift and shift of office-based practices onto video calls, both the good practices and the bad. We wanted to understand better how the shift to remote was impacting knowledge workers around the globe. How has it changed people's expectations of work? What groups are doing better and who's struggling? And perhaps most importantly, what practices, policies, and tools can we provide to make work better for everybody? So we surveyed over 9,000 knowledge workers around the globe, US, UK, France, Germany, Japan, and Australia to see what was working back in July. We're going to do this every quarter, by the way. The top benefits are what we all see: the reduced commute, better work-life balance, and saving a little bit of money. The top challenges: Wi-Fi connectivity, which actually cuts across income levels. But importantly, maintaining relationships. We'll come back to this a few times. The sense of belonging in your team, the social capital that we need to build at work. Last, definitely not least, staying focused. We see this for a lot of individual team members that are grappling with work demands combined with very new and very challenging home environments. But you also see it in middle managers and others who are struggling with staying on top of the workload and understanding what's going on and being able to effectively communicate with their teams. Even so, the change that we see opened people's eyes to new potential for rethinking work and home in the balance. It's also a chance to rethink where work gets done. Only 12% of the people we surveyed want to return to the office full-time 5 days a week. But only 16% want to work remotely 5 days a week and never come into an office. The vast majority of us want flexibility. We want to work in a hybrid environment where we can work from home much more often, but leverage physical space together when it's needed. People's expectations have changed. For leading companies, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to tap into more distributed teams with flexible work schedules. It's an opportunity to tap broader talent and more diverse talent pools. Those that don't risk losing out to those that do. But we wanted to go one layer deeper to understand what's working and what's not. So we asked the 4,700 remote workers who were working fully remote in July whether key aspects of their work was better or worse than when they're in the office. Nearly 3 times the number of people told us that their work-life balance in remote work was better than it was in the office. Not too surprising. Over twice as many, though, said that their work-related stress was lower while working remote. Think about the environment we're all operating in and what that says. Our study, along with lots of others, showed that productivity improved for more people than it declined. But when you get to belonging, things get more challenging. More people are struggling with belonging, with connections with their peers and their coworkers, than those that are doing better. Still, overall, more than twice as many people felt that working remotely was more satisfying to them than the office-based environment they came from. We want to go deeper than that too, though, to understand more about the people in that worst category and what we can do to help them. So we built the Remote Employee Experience Index. We took each of those 5 elements that I walked you through and scored each of them on a scale from much better, somewhat better, about the same, a little bit worse, and a lot worse, comparing remote with being in the office. The highest possible score of plus 100 would indicate that all remote knowledge workers felt that all of those dimensions were much better. Negative 100 means that everything's worse for everybody. What this allows us to do is compare results across different groups, different demographics, different countries, and importantly, across different practices and policies. So let's get into where the differences showed up the most. We started by looking at how the shift has impacted people from diverse backgrounds. We know that diverse teams build better products, but today's challenges are often greater for people of color and for women with children. At a time when our Black coworkers are challenged on many fronts, they're often not feeling as supported at work as their white colleagues. Our survey showed that Black employees are far less likely to agree that they feel supported by their manager, treated fairly at work, or that they can count on their coworkers. We should all be concerned about results like these. They show that the racial inequities we're seeing in the news are playing out in people's experiences day to day at work. So we went a little deeper. How has the remote work experience impacted these groups? It turns out Black knowledge workers have a higher overall index score for remote work than their white colleagues. The most dramatic difference was in that sense of belonging, where Black employees felt a higher sense of belonging. They felt better working remote, while white employees on average were negative. This demands a lot greater exploration. Why is it that remote work is helping level the experience? Have white employees always felt more of a sense of belonging in a majority white workplace? The norms of digital workplaces, of digital headquarters, have yet to be written. This is a real opportunity to start over. We also wanted to look at gender, and particularly at people with children. We often talk about parents with children and the impacts that they're seeing. I'm a proud father myself, but our data tells a far more specific story. In the United States, it's women with children who are far more impacted. Their work-life balance, productivity, and work situation satisfaction are all far lower than men with children. And this is a phenomenon that's far worse in the US than it is in the other countries that we studied. Women with children outside the US look a lot like men with children in the United States. Some combination of the lack of childcare infrastructure and cultural norms is at work here. Companies are being asked to respond. They're being asked to respond either with support or with more flexible work schedules. Both of these issues are critical. Diverse teams yield better results. And in the US, over the next decade, 62% of new employees will be women and 72% will be non-white. Another group that stood out as far more challenged are middle managers. Middle managers are struggling far more than individual contributors and more than senior executives. They're struggling with a sense of belonging, with productivity, and with their work arrangements. Middle managers are caught. Senior executives have their networks, individual contributors have their peers, but middle managers often haven't built their networks yet. More importantly, middle managers are buckling under the weight of outdated management techniques. They're pulled between scientific management on one side and measuring productivity, and empowerment focused on outcomes on the other. One of the biggest concerns that came out of the survey from middle managers who are struggling was time spent tracking other people's workloads and ensuring they know what needs to be done. If you're a middle manager in that situation, what do? You call a status meeting. But it turns out that's one of the worst things you can do. One of the biggest negative impacts on belonging in our survey was status meetings. People who have regular meetings to discuss status of work score twice as poorly on sense of belonging. Teams who move status checks to digital channels, their sense of belonging was positive. Not necessarily just because of that, that's because they also reserve team time for deeper problem solving and for social activities together, social team bonding. Making all of that work, moving status checks to digital channels, and creating social cohesion remotely through digital tools relies on modern tool sets. You're all here because you're leaders in that space. Luckily, people who work at early adopters of technology also scored positively on belonging. Last, definitely not least, that 9-to-5 schedule full of meetings and always on behavior together was never the right solution for many people. And that's far more true in the pandemic. Companies that provide flexible work schedules see better results for their teams. For individuals, it not only improves their work-life balance and reduces their stress, it nearly doubles their productivity score and turns that sense of belonging negative into a neutral. Flexibility to work asynchronous on deeper work, then come together as a team yields better results. We've just started our journey as Future Form. We believe that distributed teams with flexible schedules help you tap broader, more diverse talent pools. We believe that the current environment creates massive opportunity to rethink how people, process, and place come together to build better teams, how digital headquarters help you build competitive advantage. With that, let me introduce Adam Grant. Adam is Wharton's top-rated professor. He's the New York Times best-selling author of 3 books. 2 of his TED Talks have been viewed over 20 million times. I love Work Life, his podcast, which is coming back soon, I hope. Last, the thing you learn from reading people's bios, Adam is also a former magician and a junior Olympic springboard diver. Over to you, Adam.
Brian, thank you. Delighted to be here, everyone. I'm an organizational psychologist, and that basically means I'm the guy who gets called after 3 or 4 consultants have been fired. And I've been getting a lot of calls over the past 7 months. And I think the biggest challenge I'm seeing in remote workplaces around the world is with building psychological safety. I think you're all familiar with the experience of psychological safety. You know that when you have it, you feel like you could take a risk in your team without being punished. You're less likely to make mistakes. We know from data in hospitals that when people have psychological safety, they're more willing to admit an error, and then they can learn what caused it, and then they can prevent it collectively. Whereas when psychological safety is missing, then people feel like they have to hide their mistakes, and then they tend to get repeated. We also know that it drives performance and innovation in tech companies, that when teams have psychological safety, people let their ideas fly, as opposed to biting their tongues and staying silent. And I think the real challenge in a remote world is actually creating psychological safety. We're not all in the room together. How do we make sure that people feel like they can take a risk without having to fear some kind of penalty? And I have to say, I've watched a lot of leaders destroy psychological safety over the past 7 months. One of the ways I catch it is when I hear a CEO say, "Don't bring me blank, bring me blank." And think about a boss you had at some point who loved to say that. "Don't bring me blank, bring me blank." The boss probably looked a little bit like this. And I get why leaders say this. Don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. You want people to be constructive. You don't want them to whine and complain. But I've come to believe, especially in a remote world, this is a dangerous philosophy. Because if people can only speak up when they have a solution, you will never hear about the biggest problems that are too complex for any one person to solve. The foundation of creating psychological safety is actually making it easy for people to raise problems, even if they don't know how to fix them. And I think that's important because the canaries in the coal mine who are good at detecting concerns are not always the people with the skills and the resources to do something about them. So what does it take to create a culture where people can really bring up problems? Well, the first thing I'd say is let's take the old idea of a suggestion box and let's flip it into a problem box. I've gotten to see Warby Parker do this over the last few years. They literally just have an open document where anytime you see a problem, you can submit it. And then senior leaders in the company review the channel a couple times a month, and then they vote on which problems are strategically important. So I get feedback on whether the concern I'm raising is consequential. And then if it is, and I want to work on it, I can make it part of my job to do that. And I get resources and a team around me to try to tackle it. Of Warby's 5 biggest innovations in the past decade, 3 or 4 of them have come out of that problem box directly. And I think this is a perfect way to use a Slack channel so that people can speak up with whatever issues they see. I don't think that's enough, though. I think we need to go further because too often, especially when people gain power, people tell them comforting lies as opposed to the unpleasant truths. And I think we need to disrupt this pattern. The natural way that leaders and managers are doing this is saying, okay, I gotta ask for feedback. I have to open the door. And I got to do an experiment with a colleague on this over the past few months. And the question was, what happens when we randomly assign managers to go and ask their teams for criticism? And it turned out over the next week, psychological safety increased, but then it started to fade. And by the time a year had passed, it was falling right back to where the baseline was. When leaders ask for criticism, it's not enough because sometimes they end up responding defensively. Other times they're just too busy or the issue raised is not high priority. And they send employees a clear message, either I can't take it or we don't have the time to address it. And then fear and futility end up replacing that sense of psychological safety. We randomly assigned, though, another group of managers to do something different. Instead of seeking criticism, we actually asked them to criticize themselves out loud. Some of the managers said, all right, I'll take my performance review from my own boss, and I'm just going to share that with my team and let them know that I'm a work in progress, that I have real development goals. And we found when managers were randomly assigned to do that, psychological safety took a little longer to build, but it actually increased for at least a year. Part of what's happening there is managers are normalizing vulnerability. By saying, I'm imperfect, I have a lot of areas that I want to improve in, they're making it easier for employees to adopt a growth mindset and confront their own shortcomings and mistakes. They're also giving their employees an opportunity to hold them accountable, right? Saying, if I go into a meeting and tell a bunch of people, look, I'm trying to be more prepared, and then I show up for the next meeting unprepared, it's pretty easy for my employees to call me out on that. And so I think we need to go that extra step. I don't think it's enough to ask for problems and criticisms. We actually need to open up about the problems we're already working on, the criticisms we've already received. And I had a chance to try to put this into action in a very remote context, working with the Gates Foundation. If you've ever spent time at the Gates Foundation, you'll know that every March there's a strategy review where you have to go and convince Bill and Melinda and Warren Buffett that you've spent their money well. And oftentimes people feel like they can't take any risks because if there are any holes in their work, then it might become a career limiting move. And that was starting to erode the sense of psychological safety and the freedom for people to take risks and maybe propose some wilder ideas. So my job was to try to build psychological safety. And I came in and said, look, I think it would send an incredibly powerful signal if senior leaders were willing to share the criticisms they've received over their career and what they're trying to do to improve upon them right now. And Melinda Gates volunteered. She said, I want to go first. She tasked her team with collecting 25 years of criticism on her. They printed them out in note cards. And then she sat in front of a camera and literally read them out loud. It was like the organizational version of mean tweets on Jimmy Kimmel. And it turned out that afterward, we studied this. We randomly assigned some employees to hear Melinda engage with criticism, others to hear her talk more generally about the culture she wanted to build. And then a third group was a control group. That first group that saw Melinda confront criticism, they experienced less power distance in the organization. They were more likely to reach out with problems and concerns to senior leaders, but also compliments and ideas on things that were going well that could be spread across the foundation. And they also came away believing that they could take a learning orientation or a growth mindset when they themselves ran into their own struggles and obstacles. So I think we could all probably have a little bit more humility, right? And talk about the things we're not very good at. But that's not the only way to build psychological safety. There's an experiment done by Lee Thompson and her colleagues where people are supposed to brainstorm in groups. And it turns out if you just randomly assign them to tell an embarrassing story first, their creativity goes up significantly. You get 26% more ideas on average and 15% more variety in those ideas. Because once you've told something a little embarrassing to your colleagues, you end up saying, well, I must trust these people. Otherwise, what the hell was I doing saying that? And as a result of that, you convince yourself that this is a group where you can share all your ideas, not just some of your ideas. And that brings me to the second point that I want to make, which is, if you look at what most people are doing in this Zoom world, we know that because we're lacking creative collisions, we're not necessarily all in the same room together. We need to get different heads together. So we're doing brainstorming and we're trying to say, okay, let's call a meeting and let's come up with a bunch of ideas. And I love that this is happening, except for one little detail, which is we have 40 years of evidence to show that if you had 5 or 6 people in a group together to generate ideas, if instead you'd put them in separate rooms to work alone, you will get more ideas and also better ideas on average. And I know some of you have lived this. We find there are 3 big problems in brainstorming meetings in groups. The first is called production blocking. We can't all talk at once, so some ideas get lost. Second issue is image and ego threat. I don't want to look stupid. So what do? I censor myself or silence myself on the ideas that are most unconventional, which are actually the ones that we need to bring to the table. And then the third problem is basic conformity. An idea gets popular in the room, and then we see the hippo effect, where the highest paid person's opinion becomes known, and then everyone wants to jump on the bandwagon, and we get too much convergent thinking, not enough divergent thinking. And these problems are all magnified for people who often lack status. Women in male-dominated teams, people of color, introverts, even just salespeople in a group of engineers. So we have to be especially careful to make sure that we're really hearing everybody's ideas and including every voice in the room. And the way we do that is to go from brainstorming to brainwriting. The task is to say, look, individuals have more ingenious ideas than groups do. So let's make idea generation an independent task. We'll collect everyone's ideas, maybe on a Slack channel, maybe in the chat window in the meeting. And then once the ideas are on the table, we should recognize that, yes, individuals have more creative breakthroughs than groups, but they also have more dumb ideas than groups. So we want to bring the group in to evaluate and refine and try to leverage the wisdom of crowds. And the hope is that that can disrupt this dynamic that we see in too many brainstorming meetings, where somebody with power or status silences an idea, and then everybody else says, well, that's never going to work here, or we've never done it this way before. The goal is to look for reasons to say yes, not just reasons to say no. So let's generate ideas independently. Let's bring a group together then to improve upon them and pick which ones are worth pursuing. And then we can start to make some real progress. Now, as we do that, I think we're doing scheduling all wrong. And this builds on something that Brian was talking about a moment ago, which is we don't need to be in meetings all day. We actually need time to work together with our colleagues. And I want to show you some data on this. This is probably one of the stranger formats of data visualization that you'll see. But this is a study by Anita Woolley and her colleagues, where they look at the frequency and intensity of communication between remote software teams. And they follow them for 3 months. And they want to track how creative they are and also how productive they are. And so what you see is the teams on the top are communicating much more intermittently. But then when they do communicate, there are lots of Slack messages flying back and forth. Whereas the teams on the bottom in purple, they're in much more regular touch, but they're probably having fewer messages moment to moment. And the question is, which pattern is associated with higher productivity and creativity? And it's not even close in the data. The groups on the top in green are the ones that win. They communicate less often, but they communicate in these intense bursts to create a pattern that we literally call burstiness. Burstiness is that sense that the collaboration is literally overflowing with energy and ideas. And I thought that the value of burstiness was really around people being able to build on each other's ideas, and that may be part of the story. But the data support another mechanism probably more powerfully, which is that if you're working on a project or a problem, it's engaging, it's motivating to know that other people are there thinking about it and ready to respond to you. And so I think the lesson of these data is we don't have to be in touch all day or even every day. I think every team that works collaboratively just needs a few hours set aside where they're all engaged on a common project. And they may not even have a cadence of the meeting, right? We may all be sitting there typing or analyzing data or thinking through a problem. But I know my colleagues are ready to respond by voice or by Slack in real time if I need them. And that seems to be what good group collaboration actually looks like. Now, as we do that, I think we need to be careful to set boundaries for individual work. Part of the value of this intermittent collaboration is it means we have separate time set aside where we're not stuck all day in meetings and we can actually get things done. And there's an experiment that I love in a Fortune 500 software company where there's a simple intervention by Leslie Perlow and her colleagues. All they do is they take engineers and they set a quiet time policy. The rule is there are no interruptions Tuesday, Thursday, Friday before noon. And that's the whole policy. No meetings then, but you're also not allowed to bother each other those 3 mornings a week. And empirically, it turns out that productivity goes to 47% above average if people get to manage their own boundaries, and 65% above average if the company actually makes a commitment to stand by those boundaries. Now, I don't think there's anything magic about Tuesday, Thursday, Friday before noon. What I do think is important here is that people know they have the permission and the flexibility to disconnect from collaboration and make progress on their own independent assignments. And that means that they're able to find flow, they can concentrate on deep work, and then when they open their inboxes after lunch, they often see that 7 or 8 people have the same question. So instead of having 7 or 8 problem-solving conversations, they can bring all those people together, have the discussion once. And by the way, they're sometimes also then bridging across silos by bringing together people who didn't know they were working on similar kinds of challenges. So I think it's ultimately an open question whether we should have no meeting Wednesdays or no meeting Fridays or 2 or 3 hour blocks that are carved out. But I think people need that boundary set in order to be able to work independently and work effectively. Now, that goes to a challenge that I think a lot of us are facing, and Brian touched on this as well, which is we are all struggling with time management. The data that I've read coming through the pandemic is that most people are working 2 to 3 hours longer in a given day than they were before. And this really tracks nicely with an experiment that was done in C-Trip in China before the pandemic, actually. This is led by Nick Bloom and his colleagues. And what they do is they go into this call center in China and they randomly assign some people to get to work from home. They find that over the next 6 to 9 months, they are 13.5% more productive. They are half as likely to quit. And part of that is because of the flexibility and the loyalty and motivation that comes from that. But part of that is what we've all been living the past 7 months, which is they're working longer. They don't have to commute. They don't have to do their hair. Although I realize some of us have never had to do our hair, but they're saving a lot of time and they're able to squeeze more work in. And I think that's the good news. The bad news is that roughly half of the people when the study's over still want to return to work. They miss the structure of having a place. They miss the sense of community. Some of them even say, I never thought I'd say this, but I kind of missed my boss. And not only that, despite being more productive, these people who are working from home are less likely to get promoted because they lack face time with their managers. And so I think this really reinforces a couple things. Number one, a lot of companies are overcorrecting right now in saying we're remote first indefinitely. My read of the data is there was a meta-analysis that was published a while back of every study accumulating, every study ever done, comparing telework or remote work with people who are in the office. And the data showed that satisfaction and performance are not hurt as long as people are together in the office about half a week. But if people start to go more than 3 days without being in the room together, then it becomes harder for them to coordinate and collaborate. And so I think this hybrid model is extremely important. And it begs the question, when we're all working individually or independently in a remote setting, how do we actually make sure that we're using our time wisely? I think a lot of us have struggled with time management over the past few months. I think that time management is a terrible practice in many ways, because if you analyze your calendar and you try to use your time more efficiently, number one, you're going to miss out on a lot of those creative collisions and unplanned interactions that you want to have. And number two, you're just going to become more aware of all the time you waste. I think a better option than time management is to go to timing management. And my premise here is that we cannot create more hours in the day than we have, but we can actually cadence and sequence our tasks a little bit better. And my favorite pattern on this comes from a conversation I had on my podcast with Margaret Atwood. So Margaret, despite writing Handmaid's Tale and lots of other books and novels and poems, considers herself an epic procrastinator. And for years of her career, she would basically procrastinate all morning and early afternoon. And then around 3:30, she would say she would dive into the manuscript in a panic of anxiety. And I think that's true for a lot of us. And what we don't realize is that there's an optimal timing to do different kinds of tasks. So Margaret seems to be a little bit the opposite of me in this way. I'm a morning person, and I thought that meant I was always supposed to do my creative work in the morning. Then I read evidence that I actually am more creative at night. Because in the morning, when I'm most alert, I'm also too linear and too structured. And so I'm less likely to have eureka moments and unexpected connections. Whereas at night, because I'm a little foggier and fuzzier, I'm more likely to see overlaps between very disparate ideas. And so for me, what that's meant is I've moved some of my creative work to the evening. And that means I wake up in the morning with some ideas that are a little bit more unconventional that I'm ready to execute on. I'm not working more hours in the day, but I'm trying to plan my tasks for a time when I'm most likely to do them well. And in Margaret's case, what she said was, look, I've learned as somebody who's often a night owl, I don't actually build enough energy until the afternoon in order to start my creative work. And so then she's adjusted her expectations. And that often means doing some of her more administrative tasks to create some momentum in the morning, give her a sense of accomplishment, and then she's got the freedom to really dive into a complex problem later. And I just throw that out as an example of the kind of experiments we should all be running. To say, look, there are optimal times to do your analytical work, your creative work, your administrative work, and those might not be configured as well as they could be right now. Last point I want to make about collaboration in this remote world before we turn to the panel is if you think about strong ties versus weak ties, we're all doing better at communicating with our strong ties than we were before the coronavirus kicked off. The evidence suggests that we're about 40% more frequently in touch with our closest colleagues, our immediate direct reports, and our bosses. And I think that's great, right? We've all known we need to stay in touch. We don't want to fall out of contact. But communication is down 10% with our weak ties, our more distant colleagues, people who might be skip level above or below us, people who might be at various points in our supply chain or our customer base. And I think that's a problem because empirically, weak ties actually add more to creativity than strong ties do. The problem with your strong ties is even though you trust them, they tend to know the same things than the same people you do. So they just reinforce your existing knowledge. Whereas weak ties travel in different circles, they learn different things, and they can much more quickly open access to novel information. And so one of the big questions here is how do we get people to engage productively with their weak ties? And I want to recommend an exercise that I've gotten a ton of value out of in the past decade or so. It's called Give a Toss. It's a very simple exercise. You bring a group of people together who don't necessarily collaborate every day, and you ask them all to make a request for something they want or need, but can't get on their own. And then everybody else in the group tries to fulfill the request. And that is the whole exercise. Everyone asks and everyone tries to help. So one of the first times this was ever run, somebody says, my dream is to see a Bengal tiger in the wild. And people are thinking, that's what you asked for? You could ask for anything. Why that? And this guy's like, you don't understand. Growing up, I was a tiger for Halloween every year. And I root for all the sports teams with tiger in their name, even though I never lived in any of those cities or went to any of those schools. And I've always wanted to live in a world where tigers roam free. Now, no one in the group had ever set foot on a continent where it was possible. But a few people offered to help. And a month later, this guy was flying out for a private tour of a game preserve. And unfortunately, I have to tell you, the tigers got No, I'm just kidding. But never would have happened if the request hadn't been crowdsourced to a group of people with diverse knowledge and diverse networks. So then a pharma company does this. And somebody says, I'm trying to synthesize a strain of the PCS alkaloid. It's going to cost me $50,000 US. Can't afford that in my budget. Does anyone know a way to do that cheaper? Now, I don't even know what a PCS alkaloid is, but a complete stranger from a different unit of the company volunteers and says, you know what? We actually have slack capacity in my lab right now. Sounds like a great learning project for my team. I'll do it for free and saves 50 grand on the spot. So I get to thinking I've got to run this exercise in my classes virtually at Wharton because I want students to be in the habit of giving help, but I also want them to seek it more broadly, to not just go to the familiar friends that they already trust, but to go to the best expert and the most connected person. And one of my favorite requests came from a student, Alex, who said, look, I haven't told a lot of people this, but I've always wanted to work at Six Flags amusement park. I think roller coasters are nirvana. I want to be part of that. But strangely, Six Flags does not recruit at the Wharton School of Business. So does anyone know a way to get my foot in the door? And he gets a couple offers. A few weeks later, I ask him for an update. And Alex says, I just got off the phone with the former CEO of Six Flags. And I'm thinking, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened in my classroom. Did he give you a job? Did he open up other connections or leads in the industry? And Alex breaks out into this huge grin. And he says, you will not believe the outcome. I now know I never want to work in that industry. And I was depressed for a little while, but then I realized, having ruled out that dream, Alex could pursue a different one. And sure enough, he ended up being gainfully employed, living a different dream as a management consultant who swears to me that one day he will fix the amusement park industry. But I think this is such a great exercise as opposed to the usual icebreakers we're doing awkwardly over Zoom to say, what if we put real personal and professional problems on the table and then invited a wide group of people that we should be in touch with to try to help us out? Would that create the kind of culture of generosity and collaboration that many of us want in our work lives? I hope so. And I would love to find out for sure. So let's now, given that we've gone through a bunch of data, let's open it up to a panel. I would be thrilled to talk with this illustrious group of panelists. If you're not unmuted, we would be thrilled if you could unmute yourself. And I've got a bunch of questions that I want to ask you all. Stuart Butterfield, I have to start with you. Welcome, Stuart.
Hey, Adam, nice to see you.
Likewise. So, Stuart, we've talked on and off over the years about synchronous versus asynchronous communication. And obviously, having founded and running Slack, you're a huge proponent of asynchronous. But I want to know, when do you think we need to be synchronous, and when is it better to not be synchronous?
Interesting thing I've been thinking about, or I guess all of us have been thinking about, when we imagine what's going to happen when offices are open to whatever extent they're open in the future. We've said people can work remotely. For a lot of people, that means I'm going to move an hour further out of town so I can get a house with a backyard because I've got a couple kids and this is, it's too small. If I had to commute every day, I wouldn't do that. But once that happens, people may be willing to do a 2-hour, 2.5-hour commute once or twice every other week or something like that. Whereas they wouldn't be 5 days a week, obviously. in that time, if teams are getting together once a week or once every other week, what is that time for? That's the brainstorming, that's the prioritization, that's the roadmap, that's kind of like the creative arguments and disagreements. It's kind of working through what people need to do. And then what we used to do after is everyone go and sit at their desk, kind of like factory farm housing, and use their computer by themselves, not talking to anyone else. And now, that's the part that we can create some flexibility on. So I think part of the answer comes from that. It's like when you're getting aligned on the work to be done, when you're making those decisions, when you're having the creative conversations, I think synchronous conversations are very important then. And less so when there's like long chains of individual work to happen. However, we used to say that Slack was semi-synchronous because they can really kind of go back and forth from conversations that are happening more or less live to longer term responses, because sometimes you need a degree of thoughtfulness in your response. Sometimes it takes you a couple hours to process something and really come up with an interesting response. So I do think it is those moments where people are making creative decisions and kind of coming up with the work.
Thanks, Stuart. I want to follow up on that with Nickel. So Nickel, there's this framework of interdependence I love that basically says, look, we can work pretty independently well if our project is like playing baseball, where if we each do our roles effectively, then everything will go just fine. It's a little harder if we're all doing a project that's structured more like a basketball team, where we're constantly passing things back and forth. And let me just apologize for using a sports metaphor, which I generally hate, but is actually really nicely aligned with this research. How do you think about flexibility? We all want flexibility now. We're all probably living with more flexibility than we had before. But how do you give people flexibility if they're doing a project that's structured more like basketball than baseball?
Adam, I think this is a really good question. And I don't mind the sports analogy because I think it's really perfect in this situation. And I think it shows one of the biggest opportunities, but challenges we've got with the situation we're in now. And that is teams that are most effective are not approaching their work, baseball or basketball, by just lifting and shifting the old office paradigms into the remote setting. They are actually rethinking them. So let's take your example of basketball. And I know earlier in your talk, you discussed the beloved status meetings. If we were just going to do basketball and you try to do it remotely, well, how do you do that? People can't be on the court all at the same time. But if you totally rethink and say the objective is just to get the ball in the hoop, don't forget about the rules of basketball, the constructs, just get the ball in the hoop, you might decide you could have something completely different. You don't need the people on the bench in your status meeting, just observing, not participating. And I think this redesign of work, and just as Stuart said, what's important to get done together versus what's not, is going to be the biggest challenge, but also unlocks the most opportunities.
Nickel, just as a follow-up on that, is there a tension a little bit between what you're suggesting and inclusion? Because it seems like at some level, especially because it's hard to be a fly on the wall in meetings right now, we're all by default just adding lots more people so they feel like they're in the loop. And I could see that being important, especially for women, for Black employees, for any group that's underrepresented. And yet at the same time, you're pointing out we're wasting a lot of people's time by dragging them into meetings they don't need to be in. So how do you think about navigating that tension?
So, and maybe this is a shameless plug for Slack, our sponsors here. I do also think this is rethinking, again, not just adding more people to meetings like you would have done in the office, but thinking about the components of those meetings. Who needs to contribute to some ideas? And are there then virtual or offline ways that you can update people on what was decided in those meetings? Or where you can virtually co-create, Mural as an example. There are many different ways to do that collaboration kind of a little more remotely than just forcing everybody to be on a Zoom call at 7 a.m. in the morning or 8 p.m. at night. And that's what we really need to think differently about.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Srinivas next. So I know one of the worst parts of remote work for everyone is trying to make collaboration and culture feel like it used to when we could be in the same room and eat lunch together. So how are you substituting for all that's missing from a culture standpoint?
Thanks for that question, Adam. At Northwestern Mutual, we're very collegiate organization, Midwestern company, and we're used to working with each other in a very collegiate fashion. Our company has been offering lunch to our employees on a free basis since 1920. And one of the reasons we do that is for people to come together and engage with each other. So the day we announced that we're all going to be working from home, that very night we announced that we would roll out Slack to the entire organization, because we knew that while a tool like Slack couldn't maybe substitute that in entirety, it might help. And what we started doing was we started increasing the amount of informal engagement via a tool like Slack during key leadership discussions. For example, during our employee town hall, a Slack channel was created where employees could engage in some banter and some honest questions to leadership. And leadership could simply, shall we say, be a little bit more vulnerable and shall we say, dissipate the notion of rank for a moment, right? We started doing things like that. We use Slack when we have a question hour with our CIO every other week, where employees are free to ask challenging questions, where the most amount of voted questions get to be answered, creating a sense of democracy. So lowering the barrier of hierarchy by using informal tools where the truth can be spoken more freely, and where leaders create room to be less than ideal in the way they behave and respond to questions. So Slack has assisted us in that manner. Another example would be, we've had several new employees, about 100 new employees that have joined the company. And what we've used Slack with is for those employees to submit management bugs. Tell us about what's not working at our company, and point us with your fresh perspective, the things that we as managers need to improve in the dysfunctions we have that we sometimes do not see.
I really love this idea of management bugs. It, of course, makes me wonder what happens when management is the bug. But I'm also curious about the specific challenge that people managers are facing and how you're navigating that one. So one of my biggest surprises from the Slack data that Brian presented was that people managers are actually having a harder time. I had very much expected the opposite. And so I imagine you've been seeing this up close. What are you doing to help managers get connected with their teams? I know I've seen some leaders start doing office hours, but I imagine you have some more clever techniques than that.
I mean, there's no real magic sauce here. I mean, except for that frequent, continuous engagement and really being able to check into the pulse of how the employee is feeling. Being able to spend that 5 minutes and sense their vibe, and being able to be in touch with that vibe. Being in touch with reality is the principal job of a people manager, right? And finding ways to do that creatively. For example, we've increased the number of surveys where we ask our employees, hey, are we staying true to our values, right? Are we staying true to the values of good team health, and a blameless culture, for example? And we provide that feedback anonymously to people managers. So just continuing to engage in the good struggle of staying close to the truth.
Great. Thank you. Nadia, I want to come to you now. So I floated this idea that maybe we should even have an entire day that's meeting free. Is this a good idea? Is it a bad idea? How do you think about actually socializing those kinds of boundaries within an organization?
So absolutely, I am on the yes column on this, mostly because, especially for cultures, it all depends on the company culture, especially for cultures where flexible work or having true autonomy over your time and the way you work is not as much of a norm as it would be in other cultures. Structuring the work for the entire organization allows people the freedom to say, okay, on a Wednesday or on a Friday when there's no meetings, I actually can engage in that free thinking, the free associated thinking where the ideas come up and where everyone comes up with, oh, well, these are the issues that we're grappling with that I don't have to do in real time in a 30-minute meeting with 18 people. It just gets to the point that Stuart made earlier about even people allowing having the space and time to have a longer commute allows for there to be a lack of sort of a burden on you to say, oh, I'm missing something or I have to be chained to a certain schedule. This allows for people to truly sort of relax into the work, see what makes sense for them, know that there's nothing that's happening. There's no FOMO of what's going on because they've decided to take a day off from meetings. This is something that the whole organization is buying into. And again, I think it all depends on the company culture. Before I came to Slack, I was at another company where flexible work was not the norm. And so doing this would be a very difficult cultural change to say, okay, now it's okay for us not to have meetings on a Wednesday. How can you keep tabs on people? Are people really being productive? But the reality is that it created greater focus for the times we were in meetings and allowed people to do the work and contribute when there wasn't meetings across the board.
Nadia, for the leaders who have the courage to try this experiment, one of the open questions is always, well, what do you say to the managers who cheat and say, look, I know we're not supposed to have any meetings today, but this is really important and urgent. And it's just going to be a 5-minute conversation. How do you curb that behavior before it gets out of control?
That is going to happen, right? There's a natural sort of inertia that you have to fight against around behaviors that have always been one way, and then you're shifting to a completely different approach. Accountability is something that is a way to encourage people to get on the bus. If the leaders who are deciding that this is the right thing can talk about their experiences of why this has been beneficial to them, especially those that were skeptics at first, but stuck with the program and then saw that, oh, this actually was okay. And it was okay for me too. And broadening that experience to other people that they can say it's okay to let go and not sort of a color outside the lines on this a little bit. The second thing is, I've always found that a leaderboard of some type or some type of accountability mechanism where you're showing what teams are and aren't, and then what the outcomes are, does more than anything around any stick to encourage people to the sense of competition to say, oh, I want my team to be more productive, or I want my team to feel good about, in the engagement survey or the pulse survey we do around the fact that we truly are sticking with the plan of not having meetings on Wednesdays. I want my team to be that way too. So sometimes it's breeding a sense of competition around who's in it and who's not can help too.
I can't wait for that worst manager leaderboard to be in every organization. So I want to follow up on, we've talked just a bit about diversity and inclusion and some of the challenges, but also some of the ways that remote work might be a little bit of an equalizing force. Nicole, let me start with you on this one. I've frankly been shocked and disappointed over the last few years with how many managers and leaders give lip service to diversity and feel like they've checked the box and then have not put real work into inclusion. So what can we do to get managers to really involve people and create a sense of belonging in their teams? And what have you seen actually work as opposed to just, sort of towing a company line around it?
Yeah, this is a great question. And again, I think our current environment poses some challenges to this, but also some tremendous opportunities. So when you think about current managers, what can they be doing in this environment? The first thing is the context and the environment they build within their own teams. Over the last few months, are they checking in with their diverse employees? As you think about the social justice issues occurring here in the United States, but around the world, these were topics that kind of in the workplace they would have avoided. But now that the workplace is our home place and you get invited in every day, are you checking in? How are you checking in? How are you entering into those conversations? We all have a responsibility to do that. And I think that's been extremely important. We also took a work from home pledge as a company. And that pledge was very simple around things like, it's okay not to be camera ready. Maybe it's because you got a bunch of kids homeschooling behind you in your home. Maybe it's because you're doing different things from flexible perspective and you haven't had time to take a shower and get dressed. But those types of simple things are also letting just the entire workplace be more inclusive. And then going on to Nadia's point, this idea of no meeting Fridays, really do not only help with everything we talked about from a work perspective and allowing you to focus, but they can also help with diversity and inclusion and creating space where people can take care of their personal lives, but that they also then can come to work and be present when they need to be. And we have found that some of the most effective plans for this are when work teams decide on the code of conduct. And it's not a corporate push down. They decide that, hey, we're only going to do meetings from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Mornings are free. Or they decide, just like Nadia said, hey, no meetings on Fridays. That doesn't work for our team. And that, again, also helps build this inclusive environment.
Great. Nadia, I want to follow up on a challenge that I think a lot of people are facing around diversity and inclusion in this remote world, which is we want people to feel welcomed. We want people to open up, but we also don't want to make them uncomfortable. And I have a colleague, Rachel Arnett, who's done some experiments showing that what majority group managers often do, so those of us who are white men, is we don't ask people who come from underrepresented groups about their backgrounds because we want them to fit in, not stand out. And ironically, that leads us to stereotype them more. It prevents us from seeing them as unique individuals. And you're nodding, I don't need to tell you this, right? You've lived this long before the research. But what's the best way to engage that question? Do I ask you, what was your upbringing like? What were the defining moments that shaped who you are today? Is that too personal? Where does that boundary lie?
First, thank you for even going there, because I think a lot of people don't even acknowledge the thing, which is that there is a level of discomfort around this for managers, particularly those that are not with white males, or any manager, quite frankly, that is not a minority, because you just don't know the language. You don't know how you want to how your words will land, how it will make people feel. You want to do it the right way. So therefore, people don't do anything at all, which is not the right answer. People want to be seen, no matter who you are, but particularly those that are typically on the outside, want to be acknowledged for who they are. I think especially now with the social justice movement and George Floyd protests that have happened, there's been a greater level of transparency, honesty, and dropping the veil and not keeping the mask on. And to Nicole's point earlier, people saying, you know what, I'm not camera ready. I do have other things going on in the background. It's my life. And those identities are converging. So there is a greater openness and grace right now and I hope that it stays into perpetuity, for managers and employees to really engage on an honest level about who they are, what's important to them, how they want to be supported. So it's okay for you to ask any employee, but particularly those of color, what's the best way in this moment, particularly when you have something like a George Floyd issue that happened, to support you? What do you need? And then creating the space for people to process what's going on in their own way. And there's no judgment around it, and there's no criticism, because everyone's going through this journey together. So that's one, is continuing to do that, and being okay with asking the wrong question. And I also have to say this for those of us that are of color, I have personal experience with this, leading HR, going through this for an organization. We also have to give grace to people who are just figuring it out themselves too. So no judgment of people asking me the wrong question, using the wrong word. It's a mutual understanding that we all have to dig in together to get to a better place.
Thank you. Stuart, I want to follow up with you on this one, because you've been very active around Black Lives Matter and with making it clear that Slack supports diversity and inclusion in a very significant way. I know that as a white man, I was often uncomfortable to speak about issues, first of sexism and then racism, because I thought it wasn't my place. And then I read this evidence showing that when women and minorities advocate for diversity, they tend to get penalized a little bit because people see it as nepotistic or self-serving. Whereas when white men do it, they often get applauded for it. It's like, oh, what a good guy. He cares about a group that's not his own. And I think that, first of all, those data should not exist, right? It is a travesty that we don't recognize that when a woman or minority advocates for diversity, that she's actually putting her career on the line, or he's putting his career on the line to try to create justice and fairness. But I think given that is still the reality for a lot of us, there's this really tricky problem, which is we do need white men to speak out. But some of us then are being accused of virtue signaling or performative allyship. How have you thought about navigating that?
I guess the simple answer is just not going to worry about it, because there's going to be a huge range of responses. It's not even just those binary outcomes, like this was good or this was bad, but a lot of nuance and a lot of like second and third order thinking about it. And you can stumble a little bit or say the wrong thing, but I think I judge myself, I guess, to be able to tell the difference of something that's directionally correct and something that's not. And as long as I think it's, I'm doing the right thing, I'm just going to do it and then take a little bit of heat. And, there's criticism no matter what. Certainly if it's a public enough statement, and I guess we're a high profile enough company that there's all kinds of commenters on Twitter and stuff like that. But there's going to be criticism no matter what. So your choice is just to be totally silent about it, which isn't effective in driving any kind of change. So if you care about the change, you have to say something, or being criticized by some people. And that doesn't give you license, and I don't think anyone was suggesting it gives you license to just say anything you want and to be thoughtless. But yeah, I think I probably racked up more negative comments for the performative allyship or virtue signaling side of things. And just got to be okay with it.
Great. So we're going to start taking some audience questions. I know we have a bunch coming in already. The other thing I want to do is I want to invite you all as panelists to ask each other a question if there's something on your mind. So I'll give a few audience questions first, and then I'll go around the room and see if anyone wants to ask a question of each other, assuming that you all have much more interesting questions than the ones that I've thought up. So let me start with a question that comes from Roy. Roy wants to know, are we dealing with any fatigue or overload with collaboration tools and technologies? And I guess the easy answer to this is if we just could migrate everything into a Slack plugin, we'd all be good. But given that we all have lots of different inboxes and portals that we're toggling between, I'd love to hear, Stuart, obviously, I know you have a point of view on this, and then one other person if you want to weigh in. What do we do with this kind of technology overload and tool fatigue?
Yeah, we're still figuring it out, to be honest. And I don't know which Fortune 500 software company you were talking about that had the nothing before noon on Tuesdays, and I don't remember what the days were, but that sounds great. We did many years ago a no meeting Wednesday or Thursday, I can't remember which one, and all the recruiters realized, oh, everyone's got free days that day. That's a great day to set up meetings with external candidates. So suddenly it was like all filled up, and that didn't count because it was external. It is really, really hard to maintain that discipline. And this is a closed forum, so I can say it because our comms team does not like me saying this publicly. But I think, Adam, you and I have talked about this before. Just like we evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to be calorie seekers in a world where there's infinite free calories, a lot of people get diabetes. A lot of the dynamics, a lot of the psychological impact of the use of these technologies and the modes of communication are deep evolutionary, hot buttons. And so we end up with almost a kind of cognitive diabetes. I don't mean just workplace collaboration. Obviously, I mean, all of the research and all of the kind of issues around the consumer's use of technology and phones as well. So it's something that I would love a good answer to. And I think that just like anything else that's kind of hard or contrary to really low level instincts, it requires a lot of discipline and it requires a lot of cooperation. I think that means that people have to make it a priority. The last thing I would say is, as has been brought up a couple different ways already, the flexibility right now I think is especially important because especially if you're a single parent with school-age children and no childcare, you're almost in an impossible situation. But everyone needs a little bit of extra flexibility right now. So having that time blocked off not only creates a little bit more space for thoughtful responses and maybe more discipline and effort that goes into the communication in the first place, so saving everyone some time, but also creates some flexibility, and that's just essential.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember a Michael Hausman study showing that the most productive employees in a company, this is across about 50,000 people in a whole lot of companies, had between 2 and 4 social media profiles. And apparently if you had fewer, you just weren't engaged with the world. And if you had more, you weren't doing your job. And so it seems like there might be a sweet spot in there. Do we want to get one more person to comment on how to handle all the technology platforms?
I think the answer is not perhaps in thinking about the platform, but the answer is focusing on what matters, right? A good manager would know that what matters is the productivity and the health of their team. And these systems are just a means to the end. They are not the end. And a good manager simply would calibrate the amount of noise in the channels for the employees and knowing when they need to be left alone and knowing when to walk away for a period of time. And that's just staying close to the team and treating these tools as just a means, not the end.
Agreed. So I think that also surfaces another challenge that a lot of us are facing, which is coordination and collaboration, not just remote, but across different time zones. It would be great to hear from at least one of you on how you think about that, especially for people who are off by a continent and are always getting dragged into really uncomfortable and unproductive hours.
So, Adam, I can just answer quickly on that. I do think this goes back to work design. I mean, this was a challenge even when we were all in the office. If you needed to coordinate with, teams in Asia, if you were North America based or vice versa. And, it gets back to this point that we keep talking about is work design. What do the teams need to come together for? Can we be as narrow about that as possible? Not just sitting on a call and listening for an hour, late at night, your time. What is it that we really need their input on? And is a meeting the best place to do it? Or are there other forums where you can be building in that input? And this is going to be the real challenge for our managers. I mean, candidly, not since the Industrial Revolution have first line, second line, managers had to think truly about work design at a task level and dissect it. So, this is something we've got to get better at.
Mm-hmm. So next question in the list is something I've been thinking a lot about as well, which is new employee onboarding. Nadia, you just went through this, right? But we do have a lot of people coming into companies now who have never met in the same room. And so what are the best practices for actually engaging somebody who's going to be fully virtual? Nadia, if you want to start, and then it'd be great to hear from another voice as well.
Well, I just started at Slack 7 days ago. I live in Chicago, and I have never met Stuart in person. So this is a real example. And we started the entire, it's been virtual for the entire process from the beginning to today. I have not met anyone on the team, not my team, the executive team, anyone in the company. I think it goes back to being intentional and making sure you have the processes and systems in place to enable shipment of equipment, someone who understands what it's like to set up this whole, technology from a remote location, someone who's based somewhere else, and being intentional about those, the design of those systems and processes to enable the conversations and the meetings and the time together to be as useful as possible. So for me, it's been overly communicative, and everyone has been explicit about every step in the process, which you need to be. So I have felt, quite honestly, quite welcome. I felt I haven't missed anything. And honestly, I feel the same as everyone else because everyone is remote. It'd be different if I was working remotely and everyone else was in the office. So this is a world where I feel very much democratized and in the same flow, whether I was there, whether I'm new, whether I've been there for 6 months. Some of the things that you do have to be thoughtful about, of course, are the smaller interactions that you're missing. Like I'm not walking down the hallway to get coffee and I run into someone that I've never met before and just engaging and to know who they are. So there is more intentionality about those meetings. But otherwise, it's been relatively seamless, and I feel just as included as I would elsewhere. And being an executive to do that too is something a little bit different than you would if you were an individual contributor.
That's wonderful to hear, Nadia. And Srini, I want to get your take on this too, because the pandemic has ended what I think you just said is a 100-year tradition of company-provided lunch, which is just sad. But new people who have never got to experience that transition, what are you doing to make sure that they do feel like they understand the culture?
I think there are just simple things. For example, I have a standing session where all new employees spend about 90 minutes, and we do that with a beer in our hand. We stop working at 4:30, and we say that, bring a drink, and let's talk about each of your backgrounds. Let's talk about why you joined the company, and we really open up the discussion and express ourselves in a very authentic and open way. And that starts to give them a taste of the culture, if you will, right? So give them those different moments where they can get in touch with the style of culture we want. So that's one thing that has worked. We've also emphasized the need for local teams to be ready to take on talent, to ensure that the talent can have a positive experience and be deliberately intentional about making sure that there is a buddy who says, tell me what's going on with you. What are you struggling with? How may I make your experience better tomorrow? Right? Recognizing that there will be dysfunction and being open to that and helping resolve some of that chaos.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. So one of the questions that's come in is about dealing with the both changing and increasing landscape of employee mental health and emotional well-being challenges. I know personally, I went several months feeling like I was talking into a black hole, and I feel like a bobblehead. And eventually, I got a Dwight Schrute to bobblehead for me, just to outsource some of the load. But I know that you're hearing from a more diverse group of employees and with a whole new set of challenges that you didn't necessarily have before. What do companies need to be doing on the mental health front and emotional well-being front? And what kinds of questions should we be asking? Nicole, I know this is a passion of yours.
Absolutely. And it's something we've been spending a lot of time on. And, it is this concept of, in this environment, acknowledging that we're all in a similar situation and it's okay not to be okay. And how do you open up those conversations? And some of the answers to it are going to be simple as just, I need more flexibility. And that's going to help my well-being, my wellness at work. There are other conversations. We have virtual yoga breaks. How do I get more movement? And it kind of goes into the next level of wellness. And then there is certainly, and we have to be careful that the first two issues I spoke about don't cloud the last one, very important, mental health diagnoses. And we need to make sure that we've got teams available when you need this help, when you need certified medical professionals. Can you get it quickly? Can you get it remotely? And can you get it without stigma? And those are really important. You got to attack this at all levels and know that people may flow in and out of the different levels and what type of support that they need.
Great. Stuart, I'm going to put you on the spot first. This is the part of the session where I want to give you all a chance to ask somebody else in the panel a question. So Stuart, who do you want to ask a question and what is it?
Ooh. Well, I'll say Nicole and follow up on the last response. We've had an interesting bit of feedback occasionally when we have said things like it's okay not to be okay and please take care of yourself, flexibility. Early in the pandemic, it was kind of like, I can't remember what we called it, ETO, emergency time off, but also just giving people the complete flexibility and responsibility. And one of the things we found was honestly blowback from some line managers who were like, I'm really having trouble kind of reconciling that with the urgency and the business and the opportunity. And it makes it much harder in certain cases to performance manage people because when people are struggling, got to respect it and got to have to make space for them. But a lot of people are just, kind of taking advantage. I don't mean in a malicious way, but their relaxed degree of input to the system is causing a lot of strain for their peers and their colleagues who are having to take up that slack and work extra hard. So I'm wondering about the little bit of finesse or threading that needle.
Yeah, look, I really appreciate you asking this question because candidly, this is what is on the mind of every first line manager that is really thinking through this. And we've tried to be very clear. The pandemic doesn't excuse poor performance in the long run, right? And as a manager, it is their job to finesse and thread the needle a little bit between needing short-term support or really where there's a long-term issue. And so we've got to be very, very careful about that. The other piece I will just say on this point from a management perspective is most of our managers, when it truly wasn't a poor performance issue, have found some way to balance the load, think about work differently. And candidly, many of their colleagues and peers want to help each other out. And they know, hey, I've got kids. So during the fall, when school is back in session, I may need to be a little bit help, but during the summer, I might be able to help somebody else out. And that piece of give and take in teams is actually creating more bonds than we would expect. There's also a third piece I will mention that we noticed very early on. And tools like Slack absolutely helped us with this. It used to be when an employee was having a trouble, They would go to their manager, and their manager had to have all the answers. What do I do about if school doesn't go back in session? What do I do if I can't get to my parents and they have health needs? We actually saw that, from bottoms up, our employees created what we call a COVID-19 support channel, and they were helping each other. They were signing up saying, hey, I have parents that live in Burlington, Vermont, and they can't go out and get groceries. And another IBMer who happens to live in Burlington, Vermont, would sign up and say, I'll get them groceries. I'll stop in once a week. We have IBMers signing up to do virtual, I'll help somebody on algebra, your kids, you can't tutor them. I'll do virtual story time for young children. And so this is an example where even that burden of support and flexibility doesn't always have to exist just on the manager. You see a whole community kind of coming together to help.
Nadia, how about you? Is there a question you want to pose?
Yes. Actually, I wanted to toss it to Srini. Just again, extraordinary culture for you to have the free lunch for a century, and has such a connected culture. And being in Chicago, I understand the Midwestern mentality of it. So when you think about breaking down that hierarchy that you spoke of earlier, the open channels, people can talk to their managers and have, ask the real questions, as get, sort of non-filtered answers. Has that openness and transparency and hopefully vulnerability sustained? Or was that just in the beginning when this was the peak of the pandemic and everyone was trying to figure it out and things have sort of mediated and gotten back to normal? No,
it really started with our recognition that digital transformation, which was a big agenda, had a lot to do with organizational health. We started to understand that there is a deep connection between the two. And organizational health does not occur in a space where there is no candor and reality, where what is spoken is different from what actually happens. So we took on an active pursuit to reduce the distance between what we say and what we do and create more reality in all conversations, encourage more dissent and welcome dissent, see employees as a lens by which we see the truth, and be okay with the fact that we are dysfunctional as leaders. We are not designed to be perfect in our decisions, and express our vulnerability and allow them to share with us what's not working, and slowly but surely address that feedback at all levels of the organization, right? And increase that candor, but in a space of compassion.
Now what I want to do is I want to do a lightning round as we wrap up. There's an audience question that I think would be a great fit for everyone to weigh in on. This is a question from Aline, who says, look, one of the themes we've talked about is this period has really leveled the experience for a lot of people. Even if it's worse in some ways for everyone, at least we're all suffering together, right? And as we start to return to the office in some places, how are you all thinking about maintaining a level playing field and transitioning to hybrid work? So what I'd love to do is call on each of you to give us your one favorite recommendation for maintaining that equality and making hybrid work work. And I know it's a complex question, but if you've got a favorite recommendation or step, we'll start there. Stuart.
I feel like this is a little bit of a cheat, but use this precious critical time now before we start the transition back to really think through the issues. Because I've talked to a lot of customers and there's a lot of deep thought. But I think there's maybe a bit of underappreciation for the magnitude of the change that is likely to happen. And now is the time.
Nicola.
So as you can tell, I'm actually back in the office with some of my essential workers. So we're kind of living this 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And I would just say, be intentional. Be intentional about what you bring the teams together for. Be intentional about teams that will be remote and in the office that need to work together. So that would be my piece of advice.
Thank you. Srini.
I would say continue to break all the rules. And I have stopped counting vacation rules for many years now. We follow the practice on long weekends. We ask our employees to finish their day at 10 in the morning because we know our employees work those weekends on when IT maintenance takes place. So break as many rules as possible. Focus on results and employee health.
And Nadia.
Nicola actually stole my word, so I'll go to my second word, which is grace. And this is not going to be perfect right out of the gate, and it's going to evolve. And we are not at the finish line. So just know that these things will continue to shift and change, and just understand that as we make the hybrid work.
Well, thank you all. I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion, and I feel like this might be peak burstiness for virtual. So Brian, back over to you.
Huge thanks to Adam, to Nicole, to Nadia, to Stuart, to Srinivas. Really appreciate everybody sharing insights, knowledge, what you're going through with your companies. That was really wonderful.